So this video is going to be about the importance of composting and the role of composting in the garden, and also about how to properly compost with these 3-bin systems. So the reason why we compost in the garden is because the garden produces a lot of excess material, waste material as you could say, but really when you have a composting system it's not being wasted. You're taking the materials that are done and you're recycling them through the system by putting them in the compost, and then they turn into a really black, beautiful material that then goes back to fertilize the garden. So it's very, very important in closing the loop for your garden and for building your own fertility. Compost has a lot of benefits to it. It's not only just like a bed for microbes, it's breeding microbes that are feeding the soil food web in your garden, which is really how your plants take up nutrients, is that the organisms will break down nutrients that are available in the material and then create it in a way that's soluble for plants through their chain system, worms being kind of at the top. But it takes a lot of organisms to make this happen, and organisms need to exist in conditions where they have food and their environmental necessities. For instance, water. Water is a very important part of the composting process, and that's something that once you have your composting system going, you're going to constantly need to check to see if it's got ample water. But what goes into a compost? Basically, the most important ingredients for a compost are water, air, nitrogen, and carbon materials. The water and the air you add, as well as the carbon and the nitrogen. The nitrogen in a compost pile is green leafy material, fresh growth, like, grass clippings, the spent chard or the leaves. Also, food scraps in your compost bucket up in your kitchen tend to be highest in nitrogen. So you want to keep a pile going of just your nitrogen materials, and those are tops of carrots, anything that's green and fresh and leafy. New growth is nitrogen. The vegetative state is nitrogen materials. And then your carbon materials are brown, woody, flowered, dried materials. And a good way of knowing the difference between nitrogen and carbon is nitrogen is green materials and carbon is brown materials generally. So when something has matured, it's dried out, it's past its flowering state into its dying state, woody perennials, those are all carbon materials. Now, a tree is a carbon material, but you don't really want to add a tree to the compost because that's too complex a carbon for the amount of nitrogen that we want to, and for the organisms that we want to be generating in our compost pile. For vegetables. Vegetables like more bacteria-dominated compost, whereas fruit trees or perennials like more fungal. So if you're going to be making a compost pile for fungus, then for trees, you want more wood scraps. But if you are doing a compost pile for vegetables, you want more easily digestible carbon, simple carbons, like a dried out sunflower stalk, or dried out grains, or dried out, lettuce that's gone to seed, stuff like that. So you want more nitrogen than carbon in your pile. The ratio is about 30-1. But generally, we just use like the layering system to the amount of materials, inches or centimeters that we use in our layering method to ensure kind of accurate carbon to nitrogen to carbon ratio. So I'm going to just go over the basics of building an initial pile using this 3-bin system, and then how to apply the layers and how to maintain the compost for the garden. Okay, so we're in this garden, it's mostly going to be a build as you go system. So you will collect amount of materials, and you might leave them in a pile, and then after you've collected a good amount of materials, you'll start layering it. So we're going to start with the very beginning of a compost layer. The first layer is different than all the other layers because it's the most woody material. You want like a bunch of sticks and things that are going to generate a lot of air. Air is important in the compost because the organisms that we're breeding are aerobic organisms. That means organisms with oxygen. So the first layer is about 3 to 4 inches, however many centimeters that is, about like this much material, maybe like 6 inches of material. That are all this kind of brown, woody, carbonous material, and you want to have like a separate pile for this type of stuff for your bottom layer that you really just need to collect for your initial building of the compost pile. You know, over time, you add all your layers, it might seem super full, but then after about 2 weeks, everything kind of collapses down. So it's really important that there's tons of oxygen coming into the compost pile, which is happening based on your carbon ingredients. You want them to be different sizes. You want them to be thin like this, or like just so that they create air pockets. It's really important. You can't just put a layer of straw down because straw will just mush and it'll form a really dense layer of where the oxygen and water can't penetrate. So it's important that you have a variety of different size carbon materials to create air pockets inside of your compost. So the first layer just goes on the bottom. It doesn't even have to be broken up that much. It can just kind of get folded and start to be placed in the bottom of the pile. It's pretty easy to do. You just collect your materials and dump them in. The easy thing about this bin system is that your walls are already going to stay straight. If you're doing a freestanding pile, basically the minimum requirements for a compost to generate enough heat is you need a 3 by 3 by 3 volume. So that's feet. I don't know how many meters that is, but it's really easy when you have this bin system. So you just add your layers. Starting with a very woody bottom to create a lot of ventilation. Okay, you can stop it. So you drop your materials in, and then you can use a fork, this gardening fork, or a rake to kind of spread them around. It's really important that you think about the edges. The middle tends to take care of itself, but the edges you want to make sure you spread the materials all the way. So this is generally what the bottom pile should look like, if you want to focus in on it. I just need like a second. Okay, so after your first layer of all this woody carbonous material, you're going to start adding the layers that will continue with throughout the whole pile. It's kind of like a lasagna or a layer cake or something where you have materials that you keep adding. So the first one that you do is nitrogen, and I've sorted this nitrogen pile, and I've used this sharpened spade to kind of chop up the materials, which you can kind of just do like this. And chopping up your materials is really good because it increases the surface area, which allows the microbes to attack it faster and more edges for them to eat. So it helps your compost pile break down faster. If you leave them all really big, then it's going to take a while, and generally we probably want these piles to be processed like somewhere between 3 to 6 months. That way they can be used every season to fertilize the garden and also used in the seedling flats. So it's important to chop up your materials. You don't have to chop them up super small, just a little bit is very helpful. So you go in and you just kind of do this. And then once you have your materials kind of nicely chopped, you take your fork and you just kind of add it. I like to shake my fork to kind of put oxygen into the initial layer. If you just kind of shovel it and dump it, it might have gotten compacted because if your materials are sitting around for a little while, they've probably already started breaking down. So when you add things fresh, like you go out and you weed something or you clean up in an area and you have a big pile of fresh nitrogen materials, you can just come and dump it in here. You don't need to aerate it because it's pretty aerated already, but once it's been sitting, it's important to kind of do this method of just like shaking the materials off of your fork. It's also something you do when you turn the pile. You get a scoop, you move it over to the next bin, and you release it by kind of shaking it. So I'm going to add a nice layer of nitrogen materials on top of the first layer of carbon. I'm going to use my fork to kind of spread it around, especially pushing it to the edges. Stop. Okay, so in between each layer, or as you add a layer, it's really important to add water to the pile. Water, just like with seeds, helps the beginning of the life process. It's very, very important. So you can take the hose from over there and bring it around and water the pile. During the dry season, which here is in their winter, it's very important that you check on the pile to make sure it's getting enough water. If it's dry, it's going to stop composting. So check on the water, include it into your water schedule, especially during the dry season. Inversely, in the wet season, you want to make sure that the pile is not getting too wet. If it's too wet, then it creates anaerobic conditions, which is without oxygen. And that's going to start breeding organisms that we're not going to want in the garden. And it's also going to make a really funky smelling material. So yeah, you want to have a cover, some tarps in the wet season. You can also cover and tarp materials in the dry season to help insulate the moisture so that it doesn't evaporate. So I'm just going to quickly layer this first layer of nitrogen. You really want to have a hose when you compost because you actually want to add a lot of water. But right now, I just have these watering bins. It's, if there's no water coming from, there's no pressure and there's no water coming from the hoses and stuff, it's better to just take some of these buckets and water in the compost pile than not water at all. So add water. How much water to add? It's kind of like, when it's fresh, you just add a good amount of water. You want it to kind of be like a wrung out sponge where it's not overly saturated, but it's got plenty of water. So I'm just going to add a couple of these right now. And you want to water the edges. Okay, so now we're going to add a carbon layer. Stop it. Okay, so the next layer we're going to add is our carbon layer, and that consists, like I said, of dry, woody, dying materials. One of my favorite things to grow for the compost is sunflowers. Here at Casa Girasol, there's probably going to be a lot of sunflowers grown, but they're an excellent material because on the inside here you see this white pithy film. It's a very simple carbon for microbes to come in and eat first. So they'll come in and eat this white pithy film first, and then they'll leave a hollow stalk full of oxygen to circulate through and then to later break down. So this is great material, stuff like this. We have different things of different sizes. Here's a little bit of that grass that people use for adobe that's harvested here up in the mountains. Here's some canna stalks that got cleaned out. Just kind of woody material, part of a fuchsia, some other vine that's dried out. This is all great stuff, different sizes of carbon material. Carbon needs to be watered better than nitrogen. So sometimes what you can do is, especially like right now, you don't have a lot of water to use. You can take a bucket and you can pre-soak your materials, and you just let it sit in the bucket for a little while, and then you come in and you grab your fork and then you scoop it out. And you dump it in. And then you just come back. I love sunflowers and compost. And then you just come in. I use my hands a lot in composting. If you've got cuts and stuff, just make sure you're either wearing band-aids or you wash your hands really well. And you spread the materials around, and then you take your next scoop and you dump it into the bucket. You want to push it down. Just let it sit for a few minutes. Okay, so after you've added your 3 inches or so, about this much material of your carbon layer, then you want to finish your layering system with just a really small thin layer, 1/2 inch or so, 1/4 of an inch, or a sprinkle of some kind of soil. It can be the compost. When you sift the compost through a sieve, all the fine material goes at the bottom, and then on the top is like a lot of like harder, kind of more coarse materials that's still yet to break down. This is great material to add to when you're building a new pile, or just any like of the native soil, and that kind of just helps inoculate the pile. Although it's not necessary to inoculate the pile, it helps speed up the process. And it helps mix in some of the soil already into the other breaking down materials. So you just want to take a bucket or whatever and sprinkle some soil on top of your layer. It's kind of like the icing on the cake. It's just really thin. Maybe like two or three of these per one, or if you only have enough for like one per layer, set of layering, that's fine. So after you add the soil, you want to start with your next layer again of nitrogen, and then you do nitrogen 3 inches, carbon 3 inches, about this much, and then soil again. And you just keep doing those layering as you build the pile up, and you water in between each layer. You want to water the edges and fill the pile with as many materials as you have, or as big a pile as you can do. So next we're going to add a layer of food scraps mixed with green vegetation material for our next nitrogen layer. Okay, so here's a good example of why it's really important to do proper layering, because when you just add, say, a bunch of food scraps to a bin, and you don't have organisms quick enough to break it down, it's really disgusting. For one, it collects all these flies, which is only a big deal if your pile is near your house. But it makes this gross anaerobic sludgy mess that smells horrible, and it's just becoming anaerobic. So that's why we go through the trouble of keeping a pile of carbon materials off to the side. It's really important to keep your carbon materials separate, so that when you do come and dump a layer of food scraps, which tend to be all nitrogen and break down really quickly, you want to sprinkle in carbon materials on top of that, so that the next layer of nitrogen of maybe, say, food scraps doesn't just build up like this and create a disgusting mess for someone to deal with. So that's why you leave a separate pile of carbon, and then you make a separate pile of nitrogen, but most importantly is the separate pile of carbon, so you can put it in with your food scraps as you build your pile as you go, sort of method. Okay, so now we've added all of our layers of carbon, nitrogen, soil, carbon, nitrogen, soil, and we've got a hose here now, so we've been watering it down, kind of like this. Hitting the edges. Okay. And now we're going to add our final layer. Basically, because we're going into the dry season here, insulation can work during wet and cold, or dry and hot times of the year. So here what we've got available is this grass material that is used for building adobe that's harvested locally. It doesn't have any seeds in it, which is great for the most part. And we've been soaking it in this bucket of water. When you put your carbon in here, you can just take a spade and just kind of push it down. It also helps kind of break it up. But this is going to be our top layer to our compost, and basically you just pick it up and spread it out. And this is going to help keep the moisture in. It's also going to help keep the heat in. If it starts to form a dense layer, then when you come into water it, just make little holes in it and then cover it back up. That way water can penetrate down. Because you're going to want to be checking on your compost pile for the moisture content. If it's too dry, then you want to add water. It's really important. So just try and make it a part of your regular watering schedule. So yeah, we're just going to go through and add a nice little layer of straw, and that's going to be the finished result. Product. Okay, so we've added all the straw, or dried grass for this case, to the top of the pile, and this is ready to just sit for about 6 weeks or so. It's going to shrink quite a bit, and after about 6 weeks or so, you're going to want to turn it into the second bin. This is a 3-bin system, so what you do is you build your first pile in the first bin, and then after it's sat for about 6 weeks, you can take off this front. You can start to scoop out the material with your fork, and then you dump it into the next bin. As you dump into the next bin, you sort of aerate it, you shake it like I did at the beginning of the building process, and you want to just make sure that you spread the materials evenly throughout the thing. Once you get down a little bit, you can actually remove this front. It's got just these 4 little latch things that you can push up, and so you can remove the front door for easy access. And what's important when turning compost is you're getting the opportunity to mix the ingredients. So one of the things that you want to do, if you can, is scoop from the outside first, the outside top layer first, along all of the edges, and you want to drop it into the center of the pile. And what this is doing is kind of mixing stuff up. And then once you've gone through a chunk around the edge, then you want to scoop into the center, and you want to put the center in the edges. So it's taking the outside and moving it inside, and then the inside and moving it outside. So you're mixing the materials well, and they all get a chance to break down evenly. In the compost pile, the middle is going to break down the fastest because it's got the most heat. This is kind of the materials that we added are kind of, it's going to be, I would say, like a medium temperature compost pile, which is actually pretty ideal. If you've got time to let a compost pile break down, you don't want to do it too fast. You don't want it to get too hot, otherwise it's going to burn off nutrients. One thing you can do, which is really awesome, is you can buy a compost thermometer. You can get this at garden centers, or you can buy it online, and it's just a thermometer with a long probe that you can stick into your pile, and you can read the different temperatures. Why you'd want to do that is because temperatures are telling you different things. They're telling you what kind of organisms you have, and if your pile starts to get too hot, then you want to turn it. If it's above, and I don't know what this is in Celsius, but if it's above 145, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, then you want to turn your pile, because after it gets above that temperature, then it's going to start to burn off nutrients. So you want your temperature to be somewhere between 120 and 145 degrees Fahrenheit for the initial time of your compost. And that's important for killing weed seeds, or that's important for any pathogens that might possibly be present in the materials. So after this sits for about 6 weeks, then you want to turn it into bin number 2. Bin number 2 is going to stay for a little bit longer. It really depends on what your ingredients are. It could be anywhere between 2 months to 4 months. And then after it's sat in here for a while, you want to turn it into bin number 3. Bin number 3 is where it's going to hang out for like another month or so. So once you go from here, 6 weeks, then you let this sit for, I would say, about 2 months, and then you want to turn it and let this sit for about another month or so, 2 months, depending on how quickly the materials are breaking down. Every time you turn your pile, you get an opportunity to see how it's doing, how it's breaking down. You know, if you need to add more ingredients of carbon or nitrogen, and that's something you can do when you turn your pile. So you can still add new materials into bin number 2, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend adding new materials once you turn it into bin number 3. You can do that, because after it's sat in here for a little while, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to see all the materials that look vegetation are going to slowly start to turn to dirt. And then in the third bin, you're going to see a lot of dirt. And you're like, great, okay, my compost is on its way. It's pretty much done. So what you do is you take a compost sifter, which this one was built to fit over a wheelbarrow. It's kind of a fine mesh so that bigger materials such as sticks and rocks and not broken down materials won't fall through. But all this screened compost at the bottom is going to be a really nice size to add to seedling flats or to add to your garden bed. So what you do is you take a shovel and you scoop out a couple. I usually do 2 or 3 small spadefuls on top of this. You want some room so you can move it around. And basically you want to get gloves because it makes it easier. And you just use your hands to rub the compost through. This is a really simple and basic way of screening compost. A lot of people have all kinds of different methods for screening compost, but this one was really easy to just build a sifter and put it over a wheelbarrow. Usually takes a few minutes to screen the compost, and all the good compost material falls into the bottom. And the thicker, bigger stuff stays on the top. You can drop this off in any place you want, any of the 3 bins. If you're building a new pile, build as you have a compost pile in bin number 1. You can just dump it in there, but as you see it's full, so you can just dump it back into bin number 3 or in bin number 2, whatever you feel like. So as you can see, the stuff on the top is still breaking down. It's just a lot of straw and I don't know, seeds from like avocados and mangoes and some eggshells and sticks and stuff. So what you want to do is just dump it back. I'm going to dump it into bin number 2. But you could do bin number 3. Sometimes you'll find stuff like trash in your compost, which is really annoying. Somehow it just gets in there. But as you see it, you just pull it out. I'm also going to talk about a few more things that shouldn't go in the compost pile. So after you finish screening out all of the fine compost, you're going to be left with that thick material, and all you do is you just lift it up and dump it into one of your bins. And then you just put it back onto the wheelbarrow and scoop up another couple shovelfuls of compost. And what you end up with is this beautiful product. Super nice compost. It's dark, rich, light, fluffy. Light in weight, I mean, not light in color. And you really can't buy anything like homemade compost. The qualities that it has that make it so desirable, worth all the fuss, is that, one, it's closing the loop in your garden. It's full of microbes. It's full of plant nutrients that are digestible right away, soluble for plants, and it helps. It's all organic matter, so it definitely increases the quality of your soil that you have. It helps retain water. And yeah, a number of other things that are super good for your garden. You can use it in your seedling flats, you can use it on your bed. You want to apply about 1 inch of compost to your bed every season, so every time you change over your crops. You can add about 1/3 of it to 1/3 of your ratio for your seedling mix. And you can mulch with compost. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can make compost tea. which I'm not really going to go into, but there's a lot of different resources out there for learning how to compost. This is one method, but there's all kinds of different ways, and you can find them, the right one to suit what your needs are as a gardener. And you can find a ton of information online. You can get books, there's tons of books written about it. I really enjoy looking into the Soil Food Web organization, which is based in Oregon in the United States. And then the Grow Biointensive method, they have a lot on growing crops for your compost. So basically you can figure out any sort of method that you want to compost, whether it's this 3-bin system or freestanding or just chicken wire with sticks. So it's really easy. There's also worm composting, which I haven't gone over, but is really interesting for smaller scale people who just might have food scraps. So you can compost in your apartment in the city, or you can compost on your property in the suburbs or at your place in the country, wherever you are living. So I hope you learned a lot from this video, and I hope that this helped to understand the flow of composting here in Casa Girasol, and yeah, happy composting.